Gather round, my Animaniacs, 'tis Pixar season once again, a glorious time of year where we don our tissues in apprehension of the Feels Fairy, and we embark on the semi-annual tradition where we ponder our obligatory ranking in the personally sacred Pixar list. An act that has become increasingly difficult and not quite as much fun as the years go by, but not quite so much as a bummer that whenever Pixar makes a merely good or fun film, but ultimately one that does not destroy our tear ducts or delves into the depths of cerebral intrigue, that means that it is somehow a failure. Though how many people really feel that, or was it really just that one Variety article? These are the kind of takes that usually come from adults that see absolutely no value in animation other than the brief times that Pixar manages to breach their emotional barrier on a level that most adult films can't do. Odd to insist that Pixar is suddenly now losing its touch when it's been a bit inconsistent through a lot of the 2010s. But even when it has its moments of lesser ambition, Pixar's entries at least always usually work for me, because where they have been fairly consistent is their approaches to character, script writing, and emotional emphasis, on top of being very technically and visually accomplished. But unlike other times where sometimes felt like I was the only one standing up for those films, as though Pixar needs to be defended, this time it seemed like mostly everyone else was on board. That Luca might not have been their favorite, but they still greatly enjoyed and appreciated its low-key, charming story, and generally a lovely movie that embodies summertime and childhood and still with some decent substance in it. And often the fun and easy watches are usually more rewatchable than some of the best stuff. In fact, I probably haven't heard this much nigh-universal feedback to a Pixar film since Coco, at least according to my own community prompts. That's still by no means everyone, and even the ones that like it know that it's not perfect, so let's break down what works and what doesn't in this extended examination of the story of the world's most adorable humanoid aqua lizards, cause it's already late, so why not? Now, the comparison to slice-of-life Ghibli films like Kiki and Totoro are made often and mostly reasonably, both in terms of having a low-key story with a quaint setting, and because the film wears its Ghibli influence on its sleeve by naming the town Porto Rosso. People that consider that branch of Ghibli a little bit too slow or dull, Luca might seem like an optimized version, as there's a lot more communication and the story moves a bit at a quicker pace. Which might be a bold claim considering that many Luca unenthusiasts would say that this feels like a movie where nothing happens, which of course isn't true because this isn't Thriller Bark, but it does take a while for the plot to establish a goal which ends up being just this tiny local sports competition. But the characters do have journeys. And true, Luca throughout the film has a very simple motive. Literally, he's just bored and wants to explore and learn. He's basically a more cautious, less obsessive version of Ariel, who also had no real motive for her land world obsession. But for those kinds of characters whose main job in the story is to explore, it doesn't necessarily need to be. But his job is essentially to absorb the experiences and the characteristics of those he interacts with and see how that changes him. However, comparing it so often to Ghibli might also give people the wrong impression, because that group of Ghibli films still puts a lot of detail into their backgrounds and time just exploring their settings. And in comparison, Luca's settings will seem more minimal. Specifically, the underwater world is nicely designed and colored and everything, but there isn't a whole lot there. It's a very small group of people and the bare bones of what we can assume is a small farming community, with a very minimal exploration of their way of life or culture. Except for later where they drop a hilarious factoid about fish being afraid of a fish graveyard, an extra fascinating line because it insinuates that it is possible for fish to feel fear and are sentient in feelings right before they help Massimo murder a whole bunch of them. Just in comparison to other fantasy underwater worlds, this looks underdeveloped. They're living in hollowed out rocky caves, they're wearing thickly woven seaweed, kind of making them just a step up from underwater cave people wearing potato sacks. However, there is purpose in this bare bones appearance. For one, it allows the audience to understand Luca's boredom, and if the underwater world did look too interesting, the audience might wish to spend more time there than exploring the actual human world. But more importantly, that it makes a good contrast with not just the people and the colors and the details of Porto Rosso, but Luca's quick proficiency with technology. Various reasons for why he finds the human world so appealing, and there's not much to Porto Rosso either. but just enough to have a very homey small town community feel, with its neat artistic touches to reflect its sea monster hunting culture. And I almost wish they had went into that a little bit more, but we can bring that up later. And its depiction of a picturesque Italian seaside town has been received with approval from the limited Italian residents that I've heard from, like my Discord artist.
As the Italian authority on this movie, I have to say that this movie really touched my heart. And also, the fact that the movie is titled like my name. Also, the fact that Julia is the same is the name of my sister. The movie is drop dead gorgeous. I was watching it with my mouth open all the time because the details and the transition and the colors are just so freaking pretty. Most of the times the showcase of a different town from a different country is rather really touristy. Every time you see a glimpse of the town or the people, or even a small detail like the kids playing or the boats or the inside of the house, you feel like that's a place that someone lived an entire lifetime with and feels familiar.
But then we get the visual masterpiece, which is the smooth transitioning between the boys' ocean forms and their human forms. This is some satisfying compilation aesthetic appeal. You see that hair pop when he landed? And can we just talk about how these sea monster designs and how amazing and colorful and adorable they are? Turning the fins into curls, and oh my god, the Uncle Ugo's and his deep sea design. There's a great combo of cute and nightmare fuel. And how even the poster is one of the best designed movie posters in years, and even their regular human forms. I have noted the Aardman influence before in the roundness, but it's still impressive how in their faces and expressions have the same level of flexibility. Like the way the mouth is able to shift position and can appear on any side of the face depending on where the camera is, like an anime character. And in addition to this visual splendor, the soundtrack is composed of a number of very famous Italian songs, and they give a very airy and refreshing tone to the film. The plot could have been a complete failure, but the animation and those transitions alone would have been a reason to see the film. But of course, it's not just that, because the characters, or rather the character interactions, are the heart and joy of this film. Alberto's introduction lets us know right away how impulsive, but also kind of inconsiderate he is, jerking Luca out of the water without his permission. He tries to seem cool and all-knowing about subjects that he knows literally nothing about, which does make him one of the most accurate depictions of a preteen ever, and of course his later displays of being possessive and pushing others away from Luca. Now of course at the end we learn a major motive for why he acts this way, but even before that, given these attributes, he could have come off as much more of a jerk than he did. He is kind of a bratty, cocky, kinda dumb kid, like most of them are. Rather, there's an immature, playful innocence to his behavior that makes him incredibly endearing. He doesn't want Luca to be a mindless underling just for the sake of stroking his ego. If anything, he wishes he could be one of those cool, unfeeling characters, but he keeps failing because of how caring and upbeat and even insecure he is.
Great. I mean, fine, whatever.
We see him sincerely try to help and teach Luca. He doesn't resent Luca for being good at things that he's not, and he stands up for him and protects him when he's being attacked. And even if he is a little callous, his confidence is necessary to help coax Luca out of his shell and his apprehension. In fact, their dynamic feels very familiar, as it was a trend in the 80s and 90s to have a well-behaved, obedient, and maybe timid protagonist being intrigued or pulled along by a cooler, more confident, and maybe even criminal friend, like Stand By Me, or Sandlot, or Gulf Diggers. Wait, what? Sorry, Gold Diggers? Does anybody remember Gold Diggers? Wednesday Addams was in it. Which makes sense, the director did say Stand By Me was another major influence on this. Which is incredibly fitting.
I'll see you. Not if I see you first.
And like that film, its intent is to capture the sensation of freedom and simplicity of childhood, which we see on display through an array of classic childhood pastimes like secret fortresses, death-defying stunts, repeating rude things they hear adults say without realizing their true meaning, and idolizing that one toy that if you could just obtain your entire life would be complete.
It's so beautiful. Yes, we need it.
Ah, baby's first capitalistic indoctrination. Get used to it, those feelings will never go away. That's why it doesn't matter that the backgrounds are so simple. It's reflective of the nature and theme of the film. Often when you play with your friends, you have to make your own fun with wherever you're located and the limited materials and resources you have. This also includes the very Arthur-like fantastical daydream sequences. And these scenes are very pretty and very funny. Now, I do wish these sequences were a little bit more narratively relevant, because not much about the story would really change if they were removed. But they do reveal the scope of Luca's desires and his imaginative and exploratory nature, as well as his fears. Basically, this entire early sequence dedicated to simple pleasures and nostalgic reminiscing, combined with all of its candy for the senses, while being one of the most convincing and characterizing time lapses of two strangers becoming fast friends, is more or less perfect. In fact, I was a little worried when they finally entered the town and wondered if the new characters introduced would alter the dynamic or the tone of the film. But Julia ended up being another very lovable character, plucky and confrontational and caring and just as stubborn as Alberto, like a slightly more friendly version of Toph. And in a similar vein of 90s nostalgia, Julia might have come across as that tomboy character, but it's saved by no one making a big deal of it, including Julia herself. Julia is not definitively anti-feminine, and the town's bully, Ercole, doesn't make fun of her for daring to be a girl at a sporting event or because of her looks. He just makes fun of her because he thinks she sucks. And speaking of Ercole, I can't pretend I was the biggest fan of him. But yes, as some people have noted, this was the first time in a while that Disney and Pixar has made a straightforward villain that wasn't a twist and wasn't sympathetic. Cool, I don't care. I don't have the same anti-twist villain sentiment that everyone else does as long as it's functional. However, I do know that the nature of a villain reflects the nature of the story, so for a simple story, it's fair to have a simple villain. Or, no villain would have been preferable if we wanted to go true Ghibli. But aside that you can't get more Stand By Me than a one-dimensional bully a-hole, except of course if he was homicidal, the concept of him being multiple years older than the rest of the kids, highlighting how truly pathetic he is that the only way he can feel tough is to boss around a bunch of literal children, was minorly amusing. I still don't love him, and mostly I was irritated at him just taking screen time away from characters I actually cared about. But he did have some really great physicality, some great faces, and amusing lines. But classic Disney villain material, this guy is definitely not. But if there is a secret sauce in this movie that we could have used a few more drops of, it is Julia's father, Massimo, as he also continues the theme of judging a book by its cover, both in that he is a very large, intimidating, gruff-looking man who turns out to be an incredibly loving and supportive teddy bear, and that he only has one arm that has absolutely no connection to some sort of tragic sea monster battle. And while it is implied, the tragic missed opportunity is that we don't get more of the growing bond between him and Alberto, as that did have something of an actual conclusion, but I understand them wanting to keep the focus on the kids. Now, admittedly, the second act feels a little bit montagey, especially once we introduce the race. It does technically give the story more of a direction than it previously had, but I was so enjoying the gentle atmospheric quaintness and the endearing characters, the last thing I wanted was to dilute it by injecting it with sports. But I suppose even Slice of Life Ghibli technically needs a climax. Alongside of getting Maya Rudolph and Jeff Gaffigan to toss water balloons at random children looking for Luca and wondering why such loving, concerning parents would risk exposing their child like this, I like how, like Alberto opened Luca's eyes to the land world, Julia follows up by introducing him to the world beyond that. That further entices his curiosity to Alberto's dismay. But it was really disappointing to see what was shaping up to be a really fun and interesting trio devolve into bickering because of passive aggression or unspoken issues, especially since Julia was fond of Alberto as well. However, I like that Luca and Alberto's relationship goes through so many phases. He was the one to help Luca become more confident, but now that he is, Luca is able to stand his ground against his friend. even calling out the fact that he in fact knows nothing, Jon Snow. Now, this moment could have completely undone Alberto's character, but at least in this desperate moment, Alberto chooses to out himself rather than push Luca, which what I was so afraid of. And Luca responds by turning on Alberto. There's a lot going on in this moment internally. Now, the use of the sea monster as an other allegory in Luca is pretty overt, and a sensation that many in, well, really any non-dominant demographic will experience at some point, is situations where you'll be pressured to pick sides between staying true to your own culture or conforming to the mainstream dominant culture, which often involves turning on other minorities. Despite a lot of his growth and built-up confidence so far, this moment is a combination of Luca's residual fearful nature and not wanting to lose the delight of the human world now that he has only recently discovered it. But this is also the result of a split-second reaction in response to Alberto doing something incredibly selfish that puts him and Luca in danger. So it is mildly understandable. But we'll also soon learn why Alberto has been so temperamental. Because Alberto's father has left, and he didn't want to lose the one other person he had gotten close to. Even as Ercole and the others throw spears at him, he barely flinches because he's so heartbroken. But what's just as heartbreaking when they reconvene is that Alberto isn't angry. He's dejected, because he does feel remorse for actions that were his fault, but they've become entwined with other feelings over events concerning his father that were not.
He's better off without me. You are too.
The idea has been touched on only briefly of Luca being the good kid and Alberto being the bad kid. Likely a leftover from a previous draft that was much more Stand By Me inspired. Because in this version, Alberto isn't a delinquent. He didn't even pressure Luca to disobey his parents.
But now I really do have to go.
Okay, bye.
It's more that he's just kind of a daredevil. But to Luca, being a good kid is listening to his mother.
I'm a good kid!
Whose rules admittedly are mostly reasonable pertaining to practical safety, but they're conveyed so strictly, and even inquiries of curiosity are struck down that it feels oppressive. And that's before she opts to send him off with Sacha Baron Cohen. Who would do that to a child? But then he himself says,
"There's usually a bad influence."
By the way, I do enjoy the theory that Bruno is Alberto's father, which also makes a possible connection that the Silencio voice inside of Luca is probably his mom. And in another context, that does absolutely nothing in this particular story, but his desire to go to school is another attribute usually assigned to good children. But for Alberto, it's much more about his personality and his actions, and also that he is somewhat of a frequent liar. So when Luca pointed his finger at him, at this second time of feeling abandoned, it does cause him to actually reflect on his actions. He was out of line, and it resurfaces his insecurities that the reason his father left, the reason why Luca turned on him, was because he was a bad kid. And that because Luca is a good kid, it will eventually have an actual life that will lead him away from him.
You're the good kid. And I'm just the kid that ruins everything. You and I should have never been friends in the first place.
But Luca wants to reaffirm how much Alberto means to him. That they're gonna travel together because he's gonna win the race on his own. Except the sequence at the start doesn't really come across as exceptionally tense or even exciting. Likely because the major appeal of the film is the character interactions, so having Luca go it alone for the race kind of makes it less interesting. Though I know that is technically a part of Luca's journey, learning to muster up his courage and determination and Silencio Bruno and all that, especially when it's for his friend. Though, as touching as the idea is of Silencio Bruno, as a metaphor for saying no to internalized negativity, it's a little concerning that the situation where Alberto introduced Bruno was when he was telling Luca to ignore his instinct that jumping off a cliff might be dangerous. Anyway, I know it's like this, so we get the high of Alberto coming in with his 11th hour rescue. I mean, technically, you could have still basically done the same, even if the three of them had raced together, but they were all quiet and uncomfortable because they're technically fighting. But then Alberto still saves him when he's in danger of being exposed. I mean, you could have basically done that. But probably the less impressive aspect of the climax that's been more sticking is how the big prejudice allegory seems to be solved just a little bit too simply. Now granted, it is a simple movie, and its messages still manages to generally hit home. However, on my first viewing, I did wonder whether or not they should have delved into how exactly the town got its sea monster hunting culture, and maybe the details of that could have been applied into the reveal for more impact. The statue, at the very least, seems to depict some sort of heroic figure or legend, and as showcased by the intro, there have clearly been eyewitnesses enough to support it, setting up a situation that feels very tangential to Paranorman. And sure, lore and explanations would have helped this world feel a bit more developed. Still, whether it would have been better to rely on the details of the lore would be very execution dependent, because if it was the most realistic explanation with a history of mutual or one-sided attacks, that would put kind of a damper on this otherwise wholesome, lighthearted story. But it's also possible that it might have messed with the other metaphor. Other series that have also done its takes on fictional prejudice often get criticized because their prejudice doesn't work in the same way that it manifests in the real world, which, you know, it almost never will, because no fictional story could replicate thousands of years of complex history. Which admittedly is why I think in the past it has been smart when Pixar has picked difficult subject matter. They've been more personal than societal. Anyway, if it's just a question on making this climax more impactful, well, if the issue is just that it ends too quickly, well then just extend it a little. Make the dialogue more intricate, more back and forth. Even the sea monster residents could have intervened, bringing home the fact that they've lived among them for years and everyone's been fine. Still, it is a bummer when the low point is at the end, because it's the last thing that audiences remember. Because the rest of the ending is really fulfilling. The town coming together, the kids celebrating, the grandmother frankly delivering the film's message.
Some people, they'll never accept him.
And of course, Pixar still finds a way to make my eyes burn. And it is great for Alberto to show that he is able to let Luca go, but understands that this separation doesn't mean the end of their relationship. And no, I don't need any of this, oh Disney, ending more of its stories with the two main characters going their separate ways. Yes, I get it, and I don't care. This is exactly my emotional wheelhouse, and I'll complain when it stops working. And this one is made even better by having the ending credits showing an elongated epilogue, which is adorably adorable. So this one is vastly superior. So that's Luca, and it may not be the best thing that Pixar ever created, but it was undeniably adorable, relaxing, charming, and kind of like Wish Dragon, exactly what I just needed at the moment. Now, originally in this video, I went much further into the LGBT discourse around the film, but that topic kinda got away from me, and it's part of why this video is so late. So I'm gonna put the bulk of that discussion in another video so I can take more time to write it. But a few highlights. At this point, a lot of people have talked about the queer coding and the allegories regarding the hiding of your identities, with the additional subtle themes of self-discovery and found family, which of course can apply to other not visually obvious ostracization allegories like refugees. But also, when people talk about something having a LGBT narrative, it doesn't mean that it's automatically a LGBT romance, but rather a story about the LGBT experience. But when watching the film, if you are more emotionally connected to Alberto and Luca's relationship by seeing it as friendship, that is fine. I certainly hope no one would insinuate that friends are not capable of being possessive and jealous or physically affectionate without romantic intention. If you are more connected to the story by reading their relationship as a crush or a budding romance, that is also perfectly okay. I mean, a number of the classic Italian songs picked for the soundtrack were love ballads. I know that accounts for most songs in existence, but you can't blame people. The only people in these discussions that are wrong are the people who tell the other people that their reading of the film is wrong. Now, if you are wondering on whether this film qualifies as queerbaiting, I'm going to direct you to Council of Geeks video, but in short, this is one of the few movies where Disney didn't promise crystal clear or ample LGBT representation when it wasn't quite there, so not really. However, there is a difference between not promising and straight up denying it. So there is stuff to unpack regarding the director's comments and response, particularly to the "call me by your name" comparisons, which admittedly even I thought when that became a thing after the first image was released was a little jump the gun. I mean, the only connections was that it was set in Italy and it starred 2 boys. I know that Luca is also the name of the director, but Luca is just a very common name in Italy. Case in point, the literal only one other Italian person I know. And the fact that the Italian voice actors for Luca and Alberto are also named Luca and Alberto just switched. Anyway, I know that a major inspiration for the film was his own childhood and friend experiences, and thus, calling it a friendship when describing his own process of writing the film is perfectly fair. But the bit where he said that Luca was a prepubescent story and ergo the story couldn't be romantic, like that was the end of the conversation, as though hetero childhood crushes don't pop up in many family movies, including many Ghibli films, repeatedly acknowledged as major inspirations for this film, and including earlier this year in Mitchell's, which, unrelatedly, also had an actual queer protagonist. Now, the director has since said that he's embraced the LGBT audience connection to the film, whether that's just response to the dissatisfaction of his comments, or maybe he just realized how harmless it was to just let the audience read the characters how they wanted, and there was no need to deny or clarify anything. Again, I will talk about this more later, hopefully. And finally, there's the question of why did this movie go to Disney+? Well, they did admit to some degree it was for experimenting with how it generates subscriptions for a still relatively new site, and if it was just because they were still playing it safe because of COVID, I would have had no problem. But it's really, why is Luca on Plus, but Cruella and Raya went to theaters? And honestly, as long as everyone still gets paid the same as they would have otherwise, I would have had personal no real beef, though I'm not 100% confident in that. But it's also possible that they got spooked because of the mediocre performance of Onward, another smaller scale, quainter original film from Pixar that was affected somewhat due to COVID, but even before then wasn't doing exactly what they wanted. Though even I admitted because of its smaller scale that Onward probably worked better on streaming because of its homey feel and its reduced expectations. And I like Luca a lot better than Onward, but I do feel somewhat similarly. Though it is possible it's not just the low performance of Onward, but the good performance of Soul. And while it is hard for me to think of a scenario in which Disney would somehow not be prioritizing profit, there is a minuscule possibility that someone was prioritizing the notoriety of Pixar's name, rather that it was more important that as many people watch Luca as possible, so that it was well known, as opposed to other entries where they just focus on wringing the maximum amount of money out of the few people that actually saw it. And Black Widow is Marvel. We've already given those guys way too much free stuff on the site. Granted, this has been a move that's been very highly criticized, and they did announce that Pixar's next film will be in theaters. Anyway, this Americanized reimagining of the One Piece Fishman Island arc took some liberties, but it is a vast improvement.